The mansion was a marvel of opulence, every corner exuding wealth and grandeur. Crystal chandeliers hung like frozen waterfalls from vaulted ceilings, their facets catching and refracting the soft glow of the setting sun. Polished mahogany furniture gleamed, untouched by time or human hands, and floor-to-ceiling windows offered a breathtaking view of the sprawling gardens beyond. Yet, for Isabella, the beauty of the mansion felt suffocating, a gilded cage that held her in silent captivity. Isabella had been left behind once again. Her husband, Richard, and mother-in-law, Agnes, had gone off on another vacation, leaving her with the responsibility of caring for Albert, her ailing father-in-law. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on her. They were off exploring the world while she remained tethered to this house, weighed down by obligations she hadn't chosen. Her days were marked by routine, each one blending into the next with maddening predictability. She would wake early, prepare Albert's meals, ensure he took his medications, and sit by his side as he stared blankly out of the window. The man who had once commanded boardrooms and steered companies was now a hollow shell, his mind lost in a haze of medication and frailty. The silence of the mansion was the hardest part. It wasn't the peaceful kind of quiet, but a heavy, oppressive stillness that seemed to amplify every creak of the floorboards and tick of the clock. The grandeur of the house only heightened her sense of isolation, making her acutely aware of how insignificant her existence had become. As Isabella adjusted Albert's blanket for the third time that afternoon, she glanced at the ornate grandfather clock in the corner. Hours had passed since Richard and Agnes had left, their laughter, and the sound of their luggage wheels fading into the distance. Richard's words from that morning echoed in her mind. "Paris isn't going anywhere, darling. You'll be fine here with Dad." He had kissed her cheek with a nonchalance that stung more than any deliberate insult. Isabella sighed, brushing a strand of hair from her face. The weight of the house and her role in it pressed down on her shoulders like an invisible yoke. She wondered, not for the first time, how long she could endure this life of quiet servitude, and whether anyone truly saw her as more than just a caretaker. The morning had been a whirlwind of activity, but not for Isabella. From her vantage point in the hallway, she watched Richard and Agnes flit about the grand foyer, finalizing their packing for yet another indulgent vacation. Agnes, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, barked orders at the housekeeper about the condition of the plants and the upkeep of the mansion during their absence. Richard, ever charming, hummed a light-hearted tune as he zipped up their luxurious luggage, his demeanor as carefree as ever. "Paris, Isabella. You really must come with us next time," Agnes chimed as she slipped on a pair of sunglasses. Her tone was so saccharine, it bordered on mockery. "But, of course, someone needs to stay and look after Albert. And well," she gestured vaguely toward Isabella, her meaning clear without needing to finish the sentence. Richard, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt, added, "It's not forever, darling. 2 weeks, tops. Besides, you're so good with Dad. He'd be lost without you." His words, spoken with a dismissive smile, carried an air of finality. Isabella didn't respond. She merely nodded, biting back the sharp retort that threatened to slip from her lips. She'd learned long ago that resistance was futile. Richard was adept at turning any argument into a display of her supposed ingratitude. As they left, their laughter echoed off the marble walls of the foyer, a cruel reminder of the life they enjoyed while Isabella remained behind. The heavy front door swung shut with a decisive thud, leaving her alone in the cavernous silence of the mansion. She stood there for a moment, staring at the empty space where they had been. Her heart felt heavy, a mixture of resignation and a quiet anger that simmered beneath her outward composure. Once again, she was left behind, the invisible force holding their perfect little world together. With a deep breath, Isabella turned away from the door and headed toward the sitting room where Albert waited. Her steps were steady, but her mind churned with thoughts she dared not voice aloud. They had gone, unburdened and carefree, while she remained to shoulder the weight of their responsibilities. And for what? She wasn't sure she had the answer anymore. Albert sat in his favorite armchair by the window, his frail frame wrapped in a thick blanket. The light streaming through the curtains bathed his face in a soft glow, highlighting the deep lines etched by years of life and, more recently, illness. His gaze, however, was anything but weak. Isabella moved quietly around the room, adjusting the placement of his medication and straightening the books on the side table. She felt his eyes on her, a silent, probing presence. At first, she thought nothing of it. Albert often stared vacantly at the garden or at nothing at all, but today his gaze seemed different, intentional. She paused, meeting his eyes for a brief moment. There was no emptiness there, no detached resignation. Instead, his expression was sharp, almost calculating, as if he were studying her. She felt a flicker of unease. Was he trying to tell her something? Or was she simply imagining things in her own growing isolation? "What is it, Albert?" she asked softly, her voice cutting through the silence. Albert didn't respond. His gaze lingered for a second longer before drifting back to the window, leaving Isabella with a quiet sense that there was more to him, and this situation than she had realized. The late afternoon sunlight streamed through the tall windows of Richard's office, casting long shadows across the ornate desk and shelves lined with leather-bound books. Isabella had reluctantly stepped into this space to tidy up, a task Richard rarely trusted to the housekeeper. This room was his sanctuary, a place where he kept the world out, and apparently his secrets in. As Isabella dusted the polished desk, her fingers brushed against a thick envelope partially concealed beneath a stack of papers. The envelope bore the embossed logo of a prestigious law firm, and Richard's name was printed neatly on the front. A sense of unease settled over her. She hesitated, glancing toward the door as if expecting someone to appear. Her curiosity won. Carefully, she slid the envelope from its hiding place and opened it. The documents inside were dense with legal jargon, but certain phrases jumped out at her. Transfer of assets, inheritance, and property distribution. Her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages, her pulse quickening. Though she didn't fully understand the technicalities, one thing was clear: these papers dealt with Albert's fortune, and they seemed to suggest significant changes were in motion, none of which Richard or Agnes had bothered to share with her. Isabella's hands trembled slightly as she folded the papers back into the envelope and replaced it exactly as she had found it. Her mind raced. Why had Richard hidden these documents? And why had he kept her, the person caring for Albert day in and day out, completely in the dark? As she left the office, Isabella felt the weight of the discovery settle on her shoulders. It was no longer just a sense of isolation that haunted her. It was the creeping suspicion that something far more sinister was unfolding in the shadows of this grand mansion. The mansion's long hallways seemed to amplify the faintest sounds, especially in the stillness of the late evening. Isabella, on her way back to the kitchen after setting Albert up for the night, caught a faint murmur coming from Agnes's bedroom. It wasn't unusual for Agnes to make late-night phone calls, but something in the hurried tone of her voice stopped Isabella in her tracks. She hesitated for a moment, then debating whether to walk away or listen. A small voice in the back of her mind urged her to stay. Quietly, she stepped closer to the half-closed door, careful not to make a sound. "Yes, it's all coming together," Agnes was saying, her voice low but tinged with urgency. "The lawyers are preparing everything. It's just a matter of time now." Isabella's heart began to race. She leaned in closer, straining to catch every word. "We have to keep her out of this," Agnes continued. "She's too close to Albert, and she's starting to ask questions. If she finds out—" Agnes's voice dropped further, making it harder to hear. Isabella pressed her ear against the door, holding her breath. "Richard will handle it," Agnes said after a pause. "He always does. Just make sure the documents are signed before she catches on." A chill ran down Isabella's spine. Though the details were still unclear, it was obvious they were discussing her. The casual way Agnes referred to keeping her out and handling her felt more sinister than any insult or dismissive comment she'd endured over the years. Isabella quickly stepped back as the conversation ended with Agnes muttering, "I'll call you again tomorrow." The sound of footsteps followed, and Isabella darted into the nearest alcove, her heart pounding. She waited until Agnes's door clicked shut before making her way to her room. Once safely inside, Isabella sat on the edge of her bed, her mind racing. The envelope in Richard's office, Agnes's whispered words, and the growing sense of unease began to connect like pieces of a puzzle. It was no longer just suspicion. There was a plan, and she was clearly in its way. For the first time, Isabella felt a surge of defiance rise within her. If they thought she was just a passive bystander, they were wrong. She would figure out what was happening, no matter what it took. The evening was unusually quiet, the kind of stillness that made Isabella feel uneasy. She sat by Albert's side in his dimly lit bedroom, the faint ticking of the grandfather clock filling the silence. He seemed, as he always did, stoic, detached, his gaze fixed on the window as though searching for something just out of reach. "Isabella," Albert said suddenly, his voice soft but steady. She froze, startled by the rare sound of his voice. "Yes, Albert?" she replied, leaning closer to hear him better. He turned his head to look at her, and for the first time, there was a sharp clarity in his eyes. "Do you know why you're the one left here with me?" The question caught her off guard. She hesitated, unsure how to answer. "Because someone has to take care of you," she said cautiously. Albert gave a small, bitter laugh, shaking his head. "No, it's because they don't think I matter anymore. To them, I'm a burden, a roadblock to their plans. But you," he paused, his gaze softening, "you're different." "What do you mean?" Isabella asked, her pulse quickening. "I'm not as frail as they think," Albert admitted, his tone firm. "I've been pretending to be sicker than I am. I wanted to see who in this family still cared, who would stand by me when I had nothing to offer." Isabella stared at him, struggling to process his words. "You faked it? All of it?" Albert nodded slowly. "Not all, but enough. Enough to see their true colors, and yours." He reached for her hand, his grip surprisingly strong. "You're the only one who stayed, the only one who truly cares." Her chest tightened, a mix of anger, sadness, and something else, validation. In that moment, she realized she wasn't just a caretaker. She was the one person Albert trusted, and with that trust came a weight of responsibility she couldn't ignore. Albert's revelation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Isabella sat across from him in the softly lit bedroom, her mind still reeling from his confession. He wasn't the helpless, bedridden man everyone believed him to be. Behind his frail exterior was a sharp mind that had been quietly observing and calculating all along. "Isabella," Albert began, his tone calm but resolute, "I need your help. I can't do this alone." Her brows furrowed. "Help with what? I still don't understand. Why fake your condition? What are you planning?" He shifted slightly in his bed, wincing as he adjusted himself. "Richard and Agnes have been circling like vultures, waiting for the day I die so they can feast on my legacy. They see me as nothing more than an obstacle, but I refuse to let them take what I've built over a lifetime." Isabella frowned, remembering the envelope in Richard's office and Agnes's whispered phone conversations. It all aligned with what Albert was saying. "What can I do?" she asked cautiously. Albert's eyes gleamed with determination. "We have to act before they do. I've been working with my lawyer, Nathan, on a plan to transfer all of my assets into a charitable foundation. Once it's done, Richard and Agnes won't have access to a single penny. They won't be able to contest it legally. It will all belong to the foundation, with you at its helm." "Me?" Isabella gasped, her voice rising. "Albert, I'm not qualified to run anything like that. Why would you trust me with something so important?" Albert reached out, his hand gripping hers firmly. "Because you've shown me something they never have. Loyalty. You've cared for me without expecting anything in return. That makes you more qualified than anyone else in this family." Her heart raced as the weight of his words sank in. She had spent years being dismissed, overlooked, treated as little more than a servant in her own marriage. Now, here was Albert, placing his entire fortune and trust in her hands. "It won't be easy," Albert continued. "They'll fight us every step of the way if they find out. That's why we need to work quickly and discreetly. Will you help me, Isabella?" She hesitated for only a moment before nodding. "I'll do it," she said, her voice steady. "For you and for the truth." Albert's face softened into a rare smile. "Then let's get to work." The next morning, Isabella stepped into Albert's office. a room she had rarely entered before. It was far less grand than Richard's, tucked away at the back of the mansion, but its simplicity held an air of purpose. Albert was already seated at the desk, his hands resting on a leather-bound folder. "This is where it begins," he said, sliding the folder toward her. Inside were financial statements, property deeds, and legal documents, all meticulously organized. "These are the records they don't think I've kept. It's proof of everything I own and how they've been trying to manipulate me into relinquishing control." Isabella sat down, scanning the pages with growing unease. "They've already started making moves," she murmured, her thoughts flashing back to the envelope in Richard's office and Agnes's secretive calls. Albert nodded grimly. "Exactly. That's why we need Nathan. He's been my lawyer for decades, and the only one I trust. If anyone can help us secure the foundation before Richard and Agnes catch on, it's him." Isabella picked up the phone and dialed the number Albert gave her. Nathan answered almost immediately, his voice calm but tinged with curiosity. "Mr. Vasconcelos, it's been some time. What can I do for you?" Albert leaned closer to the receiver. "Nathan, I need your help with something urgent. I want to move forward with the foundation we discussed." He paused, glancing at Isabella. "But this time, I'm not doing it alone. Isabella is going to help me." There was a brief silence on the other end before Nathan responded, his tone careful. "I see. I'll need to come by to discuss the details." By the time Nathan arrived that afternoon, Isabella and Albert had already begun compiling evidence. Copies of suspicious transactions, emails, and even a list of overheard conversations. Nathan, a tall man with a calm demeanor and sharp eyes, sat across from them and carefully reviewed the folder. "This is a bold move," he said, his gaze flicking between Albert and Isabella. "But it's legally sound. If we act quickly, we can secure everything before anyone has a chance to interfere. Isabella, your role will be crucial. Are you ready for this?" Isabella straightened in her chair, her resolve hardening. "Yes," she said firmly. "I won't let them take advantage of Albert any longer." Nathan nodded, his expression serious. "Then let's begin." For the first time in years, Isabella felt the stirrings of hope. This wasn't just Albert's fight anymore. It was hers too. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Isabella found herself immersed in a world she had never encountered before, a maze of legal jargon, financial strategies, and endless details. Albert and Nathan guided her through the process, but she quickly realized that her role wasn't just to follow along. It was to lead. "We're transferring everything," Albert explained one evening as they sat in his office. "Properties, investments, shares in the company, it will all belong to the foundation. Once this is done, Richard and Agnes won't have a foothold left." Isabella nodded, her hands busy organizing the growing stack of documents Nathan had delivered. Each paper represented a piece of Albert's legacy, and with every signature, she felt the weight of their mission grow heavier. Nathan arrived daily, his briefcase always full of new forms and agreements. "We'll need to finalize the articles of incorporation for the foundation first," he explained during one session. "Then we'll draft a legal document that irrevocably transfers all assets into the foundation's control. Once everything is filed, there's no going back." Albert's health limited his participation, but he remained deeply involved, reviewing documents with a sharp eye and offering insights where needed. Isabella, however, found herself stepping into roles she had never imagined. She liaised with accountants, fielded questions from Nathan, and even made decisions about the foundation's structure. "I'll name you as president," Albert said one afternoon, watching her as she worked through a list of tasks. Isabella froze, looking up at him in shock. "Me? Albert, I've never run anything before. I wouldn't even know where to start." "You'll learn," he said simply. "You're already proving that you can handle this. And more importantly, you care about doing the right thing. That's what this foundation will need. Leadership with integrity, not greed." Though the thought terrified her, Isabella couldn't deny the small spark of pride that his words ignited. She had spent so long in the shadows, defined by the roles others had given her. Richard's wife, Agnes's helper, Albert's caretaker. Now she was beginning to realize her own potential. Every step of the process brought her closer to that realization. She spent hours poring over the foundation's mission statement, collaborating with Nathan on how to distribute its funds. Albert insisted that it support educational opportunities, healthcare initiatives, and local community projects. "I want this to mean something," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. One night, after hours of work, Isabella finally closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. The mansion was silent, the only sound the faint hum of the wind outside. For the first time, she felt a glimmer of hope, not just for Albert, but for herself. This wasn't just about taking down Richard and Agnes. It was about building something new, something meaningful. As she turned off the desk lamp, she whispered to herself, "We're gonna win this." The morning air in the mansion was heavy with tension. Richard paced the length of his office, his jaw clenched and brow furrowed. His phone was pressed tightly to his ear as he spoke with one of the estate's financial advisors. "What do you mean there's been movement in the accounts?" Richard snapped, his voice sharp enough to echo down the hallway. "I wasn't informed of any transfers." The response on the other end of the line seemed to do little to calm him. He abruptly ended the call, throwing the phone onto his desk and running a hand through his hair. Something was wrong. He could feel it. Agnes entered the room just as he began rifling through the papers on his desk. She was dressed impeccably, as always, but her demeanor was far less composed than usual. "What's going on, Richard?" she asked, her voice tinged with unease. "There's been activity in Dad's accounts," Richard said, his eyes narrowing. "Transfers, meetings with lawyers, changes in investments, and I wasn't informed. That doesn't happen unless someone's meddling." Agnes stiffened, her grip tightening on the back of a chair. "But who could it be? Your father barely leaves his room. And Isabella?" She trailed off, dismissing the idea with a wave of her hand. "She wouldn't dare. She doesn't know the first thing about finances." Richard's expression darkened. "Doesn't she?" he muttered. Agnes's eyes widened slightly, but she shook her head. "No, she's just the caretaker. She doesn't have the influence or the knowledge to do something like this." Richard, however, wasn't convinced. He thought back to the last few weeks, to Isabella's sudden assertiveness and the way she had been spending more time in Albert's office. Something didn't sit right with him. "We need to keep an eye on her," Richard said finally, his voice low and cold. "If she's involved in this, I'll find out." Agnes bit her lip, her usual poise slipping. What if your father is the one orchestrating this?" Richard laughed bitterly. "Dad? Please, he's barely coherent half the time. This is someone else's doing, and I have a feeling Isabella knows more than she's letting on." Agnes glanced nervously at the door, her mind racing. For the first time, cracks were beginning to show in their confidence. Unbeknownst to them, the foundation was already taking shape, and Isabella was no longer the passive observer they had once dismissed. Isabella was at Albert's desk, reviewing the latest stack of documents Nathan had sent over. The quiet hum of the house made her feel slightly at ease, though the tension of the last few weeks still lingered in her chest. She carefully arranged the papers, ensuring they were in order before sliding them into a folder. Suddenly, the sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway. Her heart jolted. The confident, heavy stride could only belong to Richard. Before she could act, the door swung open. Richard stood there, his eyes immediately narrowing as they landed on the desk and the folder she hadn't yet had time to conceal. "What are you doing in here?" he asked, his voice sharp and laced with suspicion. Isabella froze for a split second before forcing a calm expression. "I was organizing some of Albert's medical records," she replied, holding up a random sheet of paper from the desk. "He asked me to." Richard's gaze flicked to the folder. "That doesn't look like medical paperwork." He stepped closer, reaching for it. Thinking quickly, Isabella shifted her body to block the folder, clutching the papers in her hands more tightly. "It's nothing you'd be interested in, Richard," she said, infusing her voice with just enough annoyance to sound believable, "unless you've suddenly taken an interest in your father's daily care schedule." Her words seemed to hit a nerve. Richard stopped, his lips curling into a dismissive smirk. "Hardly," he muttered, stepping back. "Just don't waste too much time on that old man. He doesn't even know half of what's happening around him anymore." Isabella's stomach churned at his callous remark, but she kept her face neutral. As Richard turned and left the room, she exhaled quietly, her fingers trembling as she secured the folder and tucked it safely out of sight. That was too close. She couldn't afford another slip-up. Tightening her resolve, Isabella promised herself that she would be more cautious. The plan was too important, and she wasn't about to let Richard's arrogance unravel everything they had built. The grand living room of the mansion, usually a space of polished decorum, was heavy with tension. Richard and Agnes had just returned from their luxurious vacation, their laughter and carefree attitude lingering for only moments before they were summoned by Albert. Isabella stood quietly by the side of the room, her hands clasped tightly, her expression unreadable. Albert sat in his favorite armchair, the picture of calm authority. His frailty was still evident, but there was an undeniable strength in his presence. Across from him, Richard and Agnes exchanged uneasy glances, clearly unsettled by the urgency of his summons. "What's this about, Dad?" Richard asked, forcing a casual tone, though the tightness in his jaw betrayed him. Albert leaned forward slightly, his eyes sharp. "This is about the truth, Richard, the truth about what you and Agnes have been plotting behind my back." Agnes's smile froze, her hands instinctively clutching the pearls around her neck. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice faltering. Albert's lips curled into a bitter smile. "Don't insult my intelligence. I've been more aware than you think, and I've taken steps to ensure you'll never get what you're after." Richard frowned, leaning forward. "What do you mean by that?" Albert reached for a small recorder on the side table and pressed play. The room filled with the unmistakable sound of Agnes's voice, calm and calculating. "We have to keep her out of this. She's too close to Albert. If she finds out..." Next came Richard's voice, cold and determined. "He's old and weak. We just need to speed things up. Once the assets are transferred, Isabella won't matter." The recording continued, but Albert stopped it, letting the damning words hang in the air. Richard's face turned pale, then red with fury. "You recorded us?" he hissed. "Yes," Albert replied calmly. "And that's not all. While you were gallivanting in Paris, I transferred everything, every last penny, every property, every share, into a charitable foundation. You no longer have access to any of it." Agnes gasped, her composure slipping entirely. "You can't do that. We're your family." Albert's gaze hardened. "Family? No, family doesn't scheme to rob each other blind. You've proven yourselves to be nothing more than parasites." Richard shot to his feet, his voice rising in anger. "You can't cut us out. This is ours, our legacy." Albert remained seated, unflinching. "It was mine to give, and I've given it to someone who actually deserves it. The foundation is now under Isabella's leadership. You have no claim to it anymore." The silence that followed was deafening, broken only by the shallow, furious breaths of Richard and Agnes. Their control, their schemes, their dreams of fortune, all shattered in a single calculated move. The weight of Albert's words hung in the air, suffocating the defiance that Richard and Agnes had clung to. Richard's fists clenched at his sides, his face twisted with rage. Agnes, still seated, stared blankly at Albert, her composure completely shattered. "This is absurd," Richard shouted, breaking the silence. "You've gone senile. You think you can just hand everything over to her? To someone who has no idea how to manage it?" Albert's sharp gaze didn't waver. "I've made my decision, and it's final. The foundation is untouchable. You'll receive what I deem sufficient. A modest stipend, enough to ensure you don't starve. But the days of your lavish spending at my expense are over." Agnes shot up from her seat, her voice shrill. "Albert, please, think about what you're doing. We're your family. We've always been by your side." Albert cut her off with a bitter laugh. "By my side? You've been circling like vultures, waiting for me to die so you could pick apart what I've built. I raised Richard as my own, despite knowing the truth about his parentage. I gave you both every opportunity, and you repaid me with lies and betrayal." Richard stepped forward, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "You can't do this, Dad. Legally, this will never hold up." Albert's lips curled into a cold smile. "Oh, it will. Nathan has ensured every detail is airtight. Contesting it in court would be a waste of your time and money, neither of which you have much of anymore." Isabella, silent until now, stepped forward, her voice steady but resolute. "You've both taken enough from him. It's time you learn to live without manipulating and stealing." Agnes turned to Isabella, her expression venomous. You think you've won, don't you? You're just an outsider. You don't belong in this family. Isabella met her gaze without flinching. I never wanted to belong to a family like this. What I want is to honor Albert's legacy, something neither of you seem capable of doing. Albert gestured toward the door. You have 1 week to pack your things and leave. The foundation will take over the management of this house. Consider yourselves lucky I'm giving you any stipend at all. Defeated and humiliated, Richard and Agnes stormed out of the room, their anger spilling into murmured threats as they disappeared down the hallway. Albert exhaled deeply, the tension visibly draining from his body. He turned to Isabella, a faint smile softening his stern features. It's done, he said quietly. Now it's up to you to make it worth something. Isabella nodded, the weight of responsibility settling on her shoulders. For the first time, she felt like the master of her own fate. The grand mansion that once symbolized greed and manipulation now buzzed with purpose. Isabella stood in the transformed living room, which had been converted into the administrative hub of the newly established foundation. The crystal chandeliers still hung, but now they illuminated rows of desks and meeting tables where volunteers and staff collaborated on projects to bring real change to the community. As the president of the foundation, Isabella felt a mixture of pride and apprehension. The responsibility was immense, but so was the opportunity. Under her leadership, Albert's wealth was being directed toward educational scholarships, health initiatives, and housing projects for underserved communities. Each decision she made felt like a step away from the shadows of her old life and towards something meaningful. In her new role, Isabella quickly proved herself capable. She met with local leaders, engaged with charity organizations, and ensured that every dollar spent would make an impact. What had once been assets hoarded for personal gain were now tools for transformation. During her first board meeting, Nathan congratulated her. You've taken something broken and made it whole again, he said with admiration. Isabella smiled, finally feeling the strength of her own voice. This is just the beginning. Albert sat in the garden, the warm afternoon sun casting a golden glow over the carefully tended flowers. For the first time in years, he felt a profound sense of peace. The weight of betrayal and greed that had burdened him for so long was gone, replaced by the quiet satisfaction of knowing his legacy would no longer be tarnished by Richard and Agnes's manipulations. He watched as Isabella stepped out onto the patio, holding a folder brimming with plans for the foundation. She moved with confidence now, no longer the hesitant, overlooked woman he had first known. Albert couldn't help but smile. You've done it, Isabella, he said as she approached. She sat beside him, glancing at the blooming roses he had always loved. No, Albert, we've done it. Albert nodded slowly, his gaze thoughtful. For years, I let my guilt and fear cloud my judgment. I made excuses for Richard and Agnes, thinking that maybe they would change. But in the end, it was you who reminded me that true family isn't about blood. It's about loyalty and integrity. He reached for her hand, his grip still strong despite his age. I trust you, Isabella. You've turned my life's work into something meaningful. That's more than I could have hoped for. Isabella smiled, her heart swelling with gratitude. You gave me the chance to change my life, Albert, and I promise I won't let you down. As they sat together in the quiet of the garden, Albert felt something he hadn't in years. Hope. The mansion, the wealth, the legacy, it was no longer a symbol of past mistakes, but a promise of a brighter future, guided by the woman who had become his greatest ally. The once opulent mansion had undergone a transformation that no one could have imagined. Gone were the days of rooms sitting untouched and lifeless, serving only as symbols of wealth and power. Now, the grand estate buzzed with energy and purpose. It had become the heart of the foundation, a beacon of hope for the community. The lavish dining room, with its sprawling mahogany table, now hosted strategy meetings where volunteers and staff planned programs for local schools. The ballroom, once a venue for empty social gatherings, had been converted into a community center, complete with a small library and areas for workshops. On any given day, It was filled with children eager to learn and families seeking support. Every corner of the mansion was repurposed. The sprawling gardens were open to the public, providing a peaceful space for families to gather. One wing of the house was renovated to include offices for foundation staff, while the other became a dormitory for young students from underserved communities who needed a safe place to stay while pursuing their education. Walking through the halls, Isabella couldn't help but feel a sense of fulfillment. The grandeur of the mansion remained, but it now carried a far greater purpose, serving as a sanctuary for those in need, a place where lives were changed for the better. This is what it was meant to be, she whispered to herself as she watched a group of children laugh and play in the garden. The mansion was no longer a symbol of greed, but a living testament to transformation and hope. Standing before an audience of women gathered for the Foundation's first empowerment seminar, Isabella felt a surge of emotions. The room was filled with women from all walks of life, some fighting to escape oppressive relationships, others seeking the courage to chase their dreams. As she looked out at their expectant faces, she realized how far she had come from the quiet, overlooked woman she once was. She took a deep breath and began. "Not long ago, I was like many of you," she said, her voice steady but warm. "I felt trapped, invisible, and unsure if ever change my circumstances. I lived in a house filled with wealth, but empty of love or respect. Every day I told myself it was just my role to endure, that I wasn't strong enough to demand more." The audience was silent, hanging on her every word. "But then something changed," Isabella continued, her gaze sweeping the room. "I realized that strength isn't something you wait for. It's something you find within yourself when you least expect it. For me, that strength came when I decided to fight for what was right, not just for myself, but for someone who believed in me." She paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, I stand here not because I'm extraordinary, but because I chose to believe I could be more. And if I can, so can you. Every one of you has the power to break free, to rebuild, and to inspire others." The room erupted into applause, and Isabella felt tears prick her eyes. She had turned her pain into purpose, her struggle into strength. Now she was sharing that strength with others, proving that no matter how dark life seemed, there was always a way to rise. "This is just the beginning," she said with a smile, "for me and for all of us." Don't miss more heartwarming stories like this one. Subscribe now and join us on a journey of love, redemption, and powerful life lessons. Hit the subscribe button and turn on notifications to never miss an update.